Welcome back to It's Not Normal, the podcast, episode 40. In this week's episode, I want to talk about what it's been like to be no contact with my parents for a year. I want to talk about some of the things that I've learned throughout that time, along with some of the responses that not only I, but I'm sure a lot of you who have also made this decision have gotten from other people when we talk about this and how to navigate those conversations. And so the first thing that I want to talk about is what led me to make the decision to go no contact with my parents. And so this was a little over a year ago, about a month after I got married. And I remember thinking after I got married, around that time, how one-sided our relationship felt. And, marriage and a wedding is such a once-in-a-lifetime moment and experience, I think, for a lot of people. It's something that I had thought about from the time that I was really little. I think especially little girls sometimes fantasize about what that day is going to be like, to finally be in love and to have found your person. It's so exciting and storybook-like in a lot of ways. And I remember feeling after my wedding like it was another firsthand example of how my parents did not and do not share in my joy if it does not benefit them. And it was really upsetting to me because I don't plan on getting married again. And so this day had come and gone without any real joy or celebration on their part. And for me, I think it made it so clear how selfish emotional immaturity in parents can sometimes be, and how one-sided these relationships can truly feel. Because if you can't even put your own issues aside for something as important and substantial as your child's wedding, I think for me it felt very clear where their priorities lie. This also came at a time when I was just starting to really uncover some things about mental health, about emotional maturity. I had just gotten The Science of Stuck by Britt Frank, and so I was being introduced to terms like triangulation, projection, parentification for the first time, and a lot of light bulbs were going off in my head. It was becoming so clear to me that so many of the challenges that I was facing as a young adult were rooted in unresolved childhood trauma. And so to have all of these realizations and epiphanies not so long after this really positive, happy event in my life that made the disconnection between my parents and myself that much clearer, it led me to feel like I had to do something about this because I could no longer go on pretending like everything was okay. And I started to feel like it was unfair for me to maintain such a one-sided relationship. And so I decided to write my parents a letter. And I think when you're dealing with an emotionally immature or a narcissistic parent, writing a letter is a really great option if you're looking to outline how you're feeling, your experience throughout your childhood, or to set some boundaries and to explain to them what the relationship might look like moving forward. I think when you're dealing with anyone who is emotionally immature, regardless of their relationship to you, having a stressful conversation with them, especially one that might involve the way that you're feeling as a result of something the other person has said or done, I think they have a tendency to get defensive. They take it sort of as a personal attack, and they deny their involvement in anything that has ever caused you any grief. And so I think in person, it can be really challenging to make any sort of substantial progress in a conversation like this. And I had tried to have those conversations with my parents for a long time. I had been asking for the same honest, open conversation to happen for 5 years at that point. And so a letter seemed like the best option for me. And so the reason that I wrote this letter was because I had come to a point where I no longer felt like it was fair for me to maintain a relationship with people who were not putting any work into healing. And so I had a decision to make. I was in a position where I was either going to avoid the discomfort and the effort and the emotion that go along with healing and continue the cycle, regardless of the negative impact that it would have on me personally or my relationships with other people, or I was going to put the work in. I was going to read the books and do the research and learn how to acknowledge and process my emotions so that I could have a healthier relationship, not only with myself, but also with the people around me. And I made the decision to break the cycle. And for anyone who has gone through this or is currently going through this, you understand what a heavy decision that is to make, because it is a lot of hard work. Healing, not only is it not linear, where you'll have good days and bad days, where you'll have long periods of peace and calm, but then a trigger will resurface and it'll bring up these emotions or these experiences that maybe you haven't yet resolved, but it takes consistent effort. It takes a lot of mental energy. Because the things that I was starting to realize were rooted in my childhood were things like hypervigilance. That was why I always felt responsible for regulating the emotions of people around me. If my husband was in a bad mood, I was fearful, or I was in a bad mood also. There were so many things that made simple daily experiences or interactions that much more confusing and complicated. And I started to realize that if I made an effort to heal these things within myself, I could start to simplify a lot of these different things. And that would benefit, again, not only me, but the people around me. It would allow me to have healthy, lasting relationships with people. And so, in part, I wanted to heal personally, but I think there was definitely another aspect to this where I wanted to heal so that I can be an example for other people in my life, young people in my life. I can foster these really positive relationships that are built on mutual respect and understanding. It seemed so fulfilling to me, but the road to get there was hard. And that, I think, is where I started to feel like it was unfair for me to be the only one that was putting the work into this relationship. I didn't feel like it was fair for me to be having these different realizations, to be facing these challenges, to be sitting with grief and confusion and sadness, anger even sometimes. But then anytime I would see my parents, I would have to flip a switch and pretend like everything was fine because I wasn't able to talk about these things in an open and honest conversation. I didn't feel comfortable being myself. I felt judged for the decisions that I was making sometimes. I was fearful, hesitant to share these different exciting parts of my life. I was fearful that they might sabotage them or judge me for them and take some of the enjoyment out of this thing. And so it became clearer and clearer to me that I would not be allowed to grow while maintaining an unhealthy relationship with people who, as far as I'm concerned, have no interest in true personal growth. And what makes this decision so challenging, I think, is that these people that we're talking about are our parents. So it took a long time, I think, for me to get to that point. Like I said, it had been years at that point of trying to have these conversations, of trying to maintain a relationship while pretending like everything was okay, never addressing the core issues, and kind of doing that on my own and keeping all of that from them because they weren't receptive to it. It wasn't going to move us in a positive direction. It started to feel like the only way for us to have and maintain any semblance of a relationship was for me to deny the existence of the most challenging issues in my life and my parents' part in them anytime I was around them. But again, for anyone who's experienced something like this, you understand how these different challenges permeate so many different aspects of your life. It's your way of thinking. It's your inner monologue. It's the way that you interact with yourself and other people. There's kind of this constant thought process that's happening that, until you make an effort to heal these things, will be skewed in one way or another by your past traumas. And so I ultimately made the decision to write my parents a letter and to outline where I was mentally, how I was feeling, and what my plans were moving forward. Essentially, I was setting boundaries. And the gist of the letter was, the next time that we have a conversation will be when you are ready and willing and able to actually start to heal these things, both within yourself and within our relationship, because it doesn't feel fair to me anymore. And I think, as I've moved throughout this last year, it's become clear to me how I would not have been able to discover myself as much as I have in this past year if I was still maintaining that relationship. Because I think when you find yourself in those interactions, it can be so easy to revert back to this childhood version of yourself, where you feel indebted to your parents, where you feel like you can't say or do certain things. The love is very conditional and the support is transactional. And so I think for me to allow myself to be open to receiving unconditional love and support where I didn't feel indebted to the other person, I had to withdraw from those relationships so that I can fully let go of my trauma responses. That is ultimately what led me to the decision to go no contact. And it's strange sometimes when I frame it in that way, where it seems like a decision that I made, because in truth, I ended off the letter asking for a conversation and simply saying that I will be no contact until you're ready to have this conversation. And so I left the door open because I, like I'm sure a lot of you, don't want to not have a relationship or a dialogue even with my parents. I don't think that it's something that we are biologically or even socially hardwired to do, to make such a drastic decision to completely remove ourselves from relationships with people who are so close to us in a lot of ways. But I think for a lot of us, it's the result of years of abuse and denial. So it's been a little over a year, and that letter has yet to be addressed. And I've gone through lots of different emotions in thinking about that, but I think I always come back to, I understand that my parents are their own people and that they've lived an entire life before I was even born that I know nothing about. And the things that have influenced them and shaped them are lost on me. And so if this isn't something that they are capable or willing to do, then that's okay. I can't change them, and it's not my responsibility to try. But this is kind of where things get a bit more complicated. Depending on the nature of your family, both immediate and extended, making the decision to go no contact with your parents might be something that comes up that you might feel compelled to address. It might be obvious to certain family members or to friends. And I think talking about that decision, even briefly, can be really challenging. I think so often people who have made the decision to go no contact with their parents are met with, "Oh, but they're your parents. Can't you just let it go? They're not going to be around forever. Was it really that bad?" And I think what we need to do when we're talking with someone who has made this really difficult decision is ask ourselves, what was said or done that was so bad that this person would voluntarily orphan themselves? Or if you're speaking directly to a parent, to say to them, but they're your kids. For someone who hasn't ever really experienced any sort of emotional abuse or trauma, it can be really difficult to understand, I'm sure, how you feel grounded in making what can feel sometimes like a very permanent decision. But just know that if you have found yourself at that point, it's okay. And it doesn't necessarily matter what other people in your life have to say about it, what their view of it is. You don't owe anyone an explanation or justification. It's important for you to do what you feel necessary to heal. And unfortunately, sometimes for a lot of us, that means withdrawing from our relationship with our parents. I remember thinking growing up, and still, my view of family, whether that's blood-related family or chosen family, is that those are the people who are there for you no matter what. They are by your side to celebrate the good times and to support you in the hard times. They will stand with you through all of your phases in life. You might have ups and downs, controversy, you might hurt each other's feelings, but there's an unconditional love there. That, to me, is the idea of family. And when I think about the responses that we get sometimes from people like, oh, well, they're your parents, I'm very well aware of that. I would love to be able to feel like I can pick up the phone and call my parents and just have a regular conversation. Like I can explain to them how I'm feeling or a decision that I want to make that maybe is really positive for me but doesn't benefit them, and be met with support and reassurance. If I'm ever doubting myself, I wish that I could call them and feel their support. Because for me, anyway, and I think for a lot of us who grew up really sort of craving our parents' approval and validation, that always felt very safe. If my parents said that something was okay, I believed that it was okay. And there are times, as a young adult still, where I crave that reassurance, where I would love to know that my parents, that I could trust them to have my best interest in mind, first of all. And second of all, to receive that reassurance from them and for them to tell me, hey, you're doing the right thing. I think creating a life without that and fighting against that all the while is so challenging. And I think that's why sometimes when people say these things to you, like, oh, well, they're your parents, can't you just let it go? They're not going to be around forever. This isn't news to us. We're very much aware of these things, but this is sort of our last resort. It's our only option to creating a life outside of this cycle of abuse and trauma. On a lighter note, I want to talk about some of the things that I have learned in the year since I've gone no contact. Because maintaining a relationship with a toxic person or existing in an unhealthy environment can really inhibit your personal growth. I think it can limit your progress because there's still part of you that feels compelled to kind of fall in line with an emotionally immature or a narcissistic parent's narrative. And I think playing that part even sometimes can cause us to revert back to past ways of thinking, to past behaviors, to kind of keep our walls up with other people who are healthier. And for me, what I have found is that completely removing myself from that environment and from those relationships has allowed me not only to discover myself in new ways, but also to be open to new experiences and relationships. And so the first thing that I have learned since going no contact, this is in no particular order, is that the people who care about you will not go out of their way to embarrass you. Embarrassment is a really interesting thing. Shame-based parenting is something that you might encounter when you're dealing with an emotionally immature parent. And when I was thinking about this and asking myself, when throughout my childhood did I feel embarrassed? There were a handful of times that I can remember that my parent almost set me up to be embarrassed. And looking back, I think they did this for a number of reasons, whether it was to make me feel like less than, or to make me doubt my perception of reality, to question myself. Maybe it was easier for them to maintain some sense of control or superiority when they were making me feel small. And this one example always stands out. I was in elementary school, and I had just gotten my first ever flip phone. and it was a very basic flip phone. It was for emergencies only. All it could do was call, and I had misplaced it one day. And I don't often misplace things. I'm very aware of where all of my things are. I like to keep them clean. I like to keep them neat. And so this was troubling for me enough as it was. I didn't like the feeling of not knowing where this thing was. I felt irresponsible. I felt upset. And I also understood that this was a new responsibility that I was taking on as a child that my parents trusted me with. And so I felt guilty for misplacing my flip phone. And so I'm walking home, and my parent tells me that they were on the phone with the phone company and they were able to locate my phone and that it's in a different country. And one of the things that's really interesting, I think, when you're dealing with an emotionally immature or a narcissistic parent, if you are very close with them, I think if you have sort of an enmeshed relationship with them, you know them very well. You've been conditioned to understand their tone and their mannerisms, minor changes in their energy and facial expressions, and interpret what those things mean. And so as my parent was telling me this, I started to feel like they weren't being serious. And so I called them out. And I was like, no, I don't believe you. It sounded like a bit of a far out story. And after me pushing back just slightly, my parent flipped a switch and got angry, got mad and serious. And so I felt like I had to go along with it. I had to believe my parent. And so I went along and pretended like I believed what they were saying, even though I could tell that they were lying. And we get home and they tell me to get on the phone with the person who now has my phone. And so I'm on the phone and there's someone else on the other line who's talking in this really hard to understand accent, and all the while I'm feeling confused and, again, irresponsible, sort of guilty and sad. And at the end of it, long story short, it was someone at my parents' job. They set up this prank. I was being recorded. I was told to say things in a different language in a funny way. And I remember leaving there feeling so embarrassed because this phone call was on speaker for all of the people at my parents' job to listen to. And it always stands out to me as just being this awful experience because I felt like I knew what was going on, but I wasn't allowed to actually sit with that and for that to be my reality and to act on it. I had to go along with what I was being told rather than what I knew. And so I think that is one of the things that kind of stood out to me since removing myself from this relationship, is that people who care about you don't go out of their way to embarrass you. And sure, you poke fun and you tease one another, friends or partners. There's a line, though. And I think that line is respected when people respect you. And I think branching off of that just slightly, people around you who care about you don't go out of their way to offer unsolicited comments or criticism about your physical appearance. This was something that I perceived to be normal throughout my childhood, even though I knew that it never felt good. Whether it was the part in my hairline or my lack of curves, me being flat as a board and so skinny, or my complexion in the winter. Being a young adult myself and having been around people of all ages, including some little ones, I cannot imagine ever going out of my way to make a negative comment about someone else's appearance or voice, the way their voice sounds, the way their hair looks, the way they like to dress. It's not my place to do those things, especially if there was any chance that the things that I was saying would make the other person feel worse about themselves. Why would I go out of my way to do this? And so that is a very clear realization that I have had over the course of this last year, because I haven't been purposely embarrassed. There haven't been negative comments made about my appearance or when I want to try a new hairstyle or sing along to a song in the car. I think more often than not, it's applauded. I'm encouraged to explore my sense of self and to try new things. And when I'm happy, the people around me are happy for me. And so that is the first one. Next is that I can feel all of my emotions, positive, negative, everything in between, and be met with patience and understanding. And this is something that I'm sure a lot of you have experienced also. When I was living with my parents, I never felt like I was allowed to express any sort of emotion outside of happiness, gratefulness, excitement. Anything that was a bit more negative leaning was sort of off the table, except for anger. I do think that there were times when anger showed. It would be during an argument or a disagreement. It was unhealthy anger. I do think that there is healthy anger, but this was unhealthy anger. And anytime I was feeling sad or upset or like something hadn't been resolved, I felt pressured to keep that to myself. And if there was even a question as to whether or not I was feeling happy or sad, if you thought that I was feeling sad, I will go out of my way to make sure that you know that I'm feeling fine, because I knew that that was not a safe space for me to express my true feelings and to be met with any kind of empathy or patience or understanding. But the truth of the matter is, and this is something that I've learned throughout healing, is that it's positive to feel all of your emotions. And what happens when you allow yourself to feel them is that you can learn how to acknowledge them, you can process them, and let them go. I think the difference when you consistently suppress these different emotions is that they are going to resurface at another time. And it's going to be much harder to understand, much more confusing to navigate, as opposed to just facing them in the moment. But when you are not in an environment to do that, you can sometimes feel like you don't have another option. I remember in The Science of Stuck, actually, one of the things that I highlighted was trauma is what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. And I think that that perfectly sort of encapsulates this point. I, in this past year, have felt such a broad spectrum of emotions. And not only have I felt them and learned how to acknowledge them and felt the benefits of processing them and letting them go, truly moving on and not hanging on to them, but I've also been able to share those with my partner and to talk these things out, to make him aware of why I'm feeling this way, where these things come from, why it's challenging for me. And then we're able to come together and work through it together as a team. There's sort of a common goal of understanding and resolution that I think is entirely absent when you're dealing with an emotionally immature parent, because all they are concerned about is how they're feeling. Something else that I've learned is that I can say no. And again, this to someone who has never experienced any sort of emotional abuse or manipulation might seem so obvious that it sounds silly. But for a long time throughout my childhood, I felt like I was indebted to my parents, like I owed them every ounce of my time and energy first, before I even owed those things to myself. And that, I think, led to me developing hypervigilance, to me becoming a people pleaser. And what removing myself from that environment has done has shown me in practice that I can say no. That if my husband asks me, do you want to watch this movie? And if I'm really not in the mood to watch that movie, I can say no. And an argument will not follow. I won't be made to feel like a bad person. My husband won't be upset and quiet and distant for the rest of the night. He won't criticize my choice of movie if I suggest something afterward. Being in a safe space shows me that I can say no and that it's okay. I think I was so conditioned to prioritize the wants and needs of my parent over my own that anytime I would be asked a question like, do you want to watch a movie? I would interpret that as meaning that my parent wanted to watch that movie and was just asking me for the formality of it. And so if they asked, then I should say yes because that's what they wanted to hear. Never mind whether or not I actually wanted to watch the movie or I would enjoy myself. Maybe I didn't even like it. But if I knew that they liked it and wanted to watch it, then it would be better for everyone overall. And I think when you're conditioned to think in that way, it can be a practice to sort of unlearn that way of thinking. And for me, the only way that I've been able to actually show myself that I am able to do this without facing any kind of negative repercussions is through practice, is to stop and ask myself, do I really want to watch this movie? And if I don't, have the courage to say no and to see what happens. And I think the really wonderful thing about this is sort of how my brain anyway has been rewired, is when I say no and I am met with empathy and understanding, or sometimes it's not even an issue at all. It's just a passing, oh, okay, what do you want to watch? That, I think, allows me to understand that the way that I was raised and the way that I was conditioned to think isn't necessarily healthy or normal. I've also kind of learned that growth is possible, not just personally, but in our relationships. I think when you're dealing with parents, your relationship, navigating these different changes can be really difficult because there may be other people involved. There might be siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, and depending on the nature of your family, these relationships may or may not be more closely intertwined with one another. And so you might have grown up with a sibling, and neither of you were ever taught how to set boundaries or to directly communicate with one another. There might have even been mistrust that was sown directly into your relationship by your parent. But what I've learned is that as you heal, as you grow, especially if you're both making this effort, you can learn how to acknowledge your emotions and to communicate those things with one another. You can set and respect each other's boundaries. You can have these really difficult conversations that throughout childhood you might have been conditioned to believe would never be possible, and still maintain a positive relationship. And that, I think, gives me so much hope. That's something that I've experienced personally, growth alongside a sibling. And I think something else that has really stood out for me that is still challenging at times, but I am much more open now than I was a year or two ago, is that I can trust others. I can have confidence in others. And I think it's common for children of emotionally immature parents to develop trust issues throughout their childhood and to carry those trust issues with them into adulthood. And this can be for a number of different reasons. I have experienced triangulation with my parent, where my parent would speak poorly about my other parent to me, just really awful things that a child should never hear, that subconsciously was sort of fueling my inner monologue when I got into my first ever romantic relationship, imagining that my partner was saying things like that to their friends about me when I wasn't around. Not only that, but I think this kind of ties back into the first point when we were talking about embarrassment and shame-based parenting. It is not uncommon when you're dealing with an emotionally immature parent for you to go to them and to tell them something in confidence. And rather than them holding on to that and respecting the nature of that conversation, they will look at that as a bargaining chip. Where now if you're put in a compromising position and they want you to do something for them, they have ammunition. They have this thing that you have told them in confidence that they could tell to other people that would be really hurtful to you. And so rewiring your brain to actually learn how to trust people, not only when you're not around, but also when you're directly communicating to them, when you are allowing yourself to be open and vulnerable, to believe that you have their confidence can be really challenging when you've been betrayed by someone who was supposed to be so close and protective of you. I can also trust both myself and my partner, my friends, to stick with me during times of change. Change was always so scary for me. I think for so many of us, it's common to feel fearful of anything happening, of anything changing, because emotionally immature parents, I think, have a hard time navigating change when things don't go to plan, when things don't go their way. And I think as their child, we can sometimes be pulled in to those repercussions. We can feel the negative effects of change. And for me, it's been eye-opening and reassuring, at times unbelievable, to know that I can place my trust in my partner, in a friend of mine, to navigate change. And for that experience to not have a negative impact on our relationship. I think that has been probably one of the most transformative realizations that I have had. And so I think those were really some of the most substantial things that I have learned in my year of being no contact with my parents. And there were a couple of things that I just jotted down that I'm not going to elaborate on too much, but I wanted to throw these in there also. The first is that I don't have to get up every time that my husband gets up. I was talking to him yesterday about some of the things that I wanted to talk about in this week's episode, and when I brought this point up, he said, yeah, you don't have to put your phone down every time I put my phone down. And that was one of those things that I was aware that I was doing, but I didn't know that he was aware that I was doing that. And again, this stems from always being told to put my phone down. Not that I was on my phone a lot, but if we were all as a family sitting around watching TV and I picked up my phone to answer a message, pausing the TV until I was done doing something, or the negative connotation around technology and phones in general, feeling like anytime I was doing anything on my phone, it wasn't productive or like I should be doing something else, that it's just not as important as what's actually going on. And while I do believe that there is truth there, the way that that was implemented was so unhealthy. And so anytime my husband and I are on our phones, whether we're mindlessly scrolling or actually doing something productive, as soon as he puts his phone down, I put my phone down. If he gets up to go and do something, I get up to go and help him. And I've realized that I don't need to do that. He doesn't expect me to follow him everywhere he goes, especially if he doesn't ask me to come along. I've also learned that I can do something on my own, for myself, by myself, or I can ask someone to do something for me as a favor and not feel indebted to them. I don't have to feel guilty. Love and support is not transactional. And lastly, I don't have to downplay happy or exciting things in my life. I don't have to downplay my successes to try to make other people feel better, because the people in my life who truly care about me will share in my joy and excitement with me. Me bringing this information to them isn't going to make them feel any worse about themselves or resent me. I remember feeling throughout my childhood almost like I had to repent every time I came home from doing something fun on my own. I had to downplay it. I never wanted to talk about it, and I would switch the subject as quickly as possible because I already knew that it was a sore subject. The list goes on, but these are some of the things that I have learned that I really wanted to talk about, because I'm sure I'm not the only one who has experienced these emotions, these feelings, these conversations. And I want to leave off by talking about some of the things that I'm still working on. And the first one for me, this kind of piggybacks off of a couple of our last episodes, talking about self-doubt and toxic productivity. For me, one of the things that I'm still working on is convincing myself or allowing myself to believe that I'm making the right decisions and that the way that I'm living my life is right for me. I think it's been challenging for me because of losing the approval of my parents and feeling judged by them or feeling like they disapprove of what I'm doing. And I think as you grow up and you take on adult responsibilities, that can be challenging enough as it is. Am I spending enough time with my friends? Am I putting enough effort into these relationships? Am I spending enough time on work and productivity? Am I saving enough money? All of these different things, these different questions, I think can really rack our brains. And I think just having that added layer of self-doubt that has sort of been sewn in throughout childhood can sometimes make understanding these things and convincing yourself that you are doing the right thing a little bit of a longer road. And finally, the thing that I want to leave off with is one of the things that I am continuously working on, and I don't know if this is something that I will ever truly let go of, and I think that that's okay, is I am trying to view my life, experiences, conversations, interactions, relationships through a very objective lens. It's undeniable, I think, that our past impacts our present and our future. And sometimes finding ourselves in a similar situation to one that we might have found ourselves in the past, where we have been abused or manipulated, tricked, embarrassed, it can kind of trigger self-protection within us. And something that I have been working on, again, that I think I will consistently be checking myself with for a long time, is approaching these different situations, whatever they might be, and not allowing a minor similarity to lead me to sort of connecting the dots or to reading too far into things and seeing something that isn't there because it feels vaguely familiar to something that I've experienced in the past that was unhealthy or that left me not feeling too great. I think I need to allow space for experiences to feel similar without jumping to any kind of conclusions. And I think it's really important to check in with yourself and to ask yourself, how objectively are you viewing this thing? Versus how is your past, maybe your past trauma, your insecurities, your triggers, how much is that influencing the way that you're perceiving what is going on? And I think this can be really important, especially in forming and maintaining friendships and relationships, because there are a lot of challenges. I think both are very complex. And just because someone does one thing once that maybe reminds you of someone else doesn't necessarily mean that they are that person, even though it can trigger a lot of those same feelings. And so I think a big part of allowing yourself to be open to experience the world in a much more loving, supportive, vulnerable way is keeping that trauma lens in check. And with that, I think I'm going to be wrapping up this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel on YouTube. If you're listening on Spotify, please be sure to leave us a rating. I will be back next week with another episode of It's Not Normal, the podcast. Bye.